All right, it is 11:30, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I do want to say, does anybody notice my new background today? For those of you who are returning, we are actually in Montana right now. We're going to be speaking at a conference tomorrow, so we traveled yesterday, and we are here in Montana doing this webinar. So we're so excited. But this is our last webinar of our summer series. If you missed any of the webinars before, they are posted on our webinar page. We still have the one up there from last week if you want to check it out. But I'm Ashley. For those of you who don't know who we are, I'm Ashley. I am the executive director of Your Choice, which is a nonprofit organization based out of Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. And you can see my mom in the middle there and Katie. We are the staff, and really our goal is to provide prevention education. Our nonprofit was started by my family because we lived through substance abuse with my brother, and going through it, we felt shunned and alone, and we didn't know anything. And so for the past 12 years, we've been providing education. We also do help families who are struggling with where to go. So that's another thing that we do as well. We do offer a variety of programs, both virtually and in person. Tomorrow we're here at the conference to do our backpack search. So we're excited for that. We also have a ton of resources on our website if you're looking for more podcasts or blogs, fact sheets, all kinds of things like that. So feel free to check that out. Just a few housekeeping items. This is a webinar, so nobody can see you or hear you. If you have any trouble hearing or seeing, though, feel free to drop it in the chat and we will help you. If you have questions, it's easier if you put it in the Q&A area that you should see on your screen. Otherwise, sometimes in chat, it can get lost. So it's just easier for us to manage. And if you would, we are offering CEU credit. So if you would like a CEU credit, it is $15, which can be purchased on our website if you have not done so yet. And if you would like CEU credit, you have to complete the survey at the end of the webinar, which I'll talk about at the end, but it pops up when you leave the meeting today. So that is my spiel. I'm going to pass it off to our presenter today, Dr. Mattek. He comes highly recommended. And as we know, this topic is very, very important. It's always been, but it is really highlighted right now with everything that everybody's gone through in the past year. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to welcome up Dr. Mattek.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Yeah, I'm Dr. Patric Mattek. I'm a psychologist. I have an independent practice in Muskego and Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. I specialize in treating anxiety, predominantly in kids and adolescents. I got my doctorate at Northern Illinois University. We have a specialized anxiety disorder service there. So I learned great cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the gold standard of treatment for anxiety, and created a program that works really well for kids and adolescents. It's pretty user-friendly. And it's so user-friendly and works so well that I use the same approach with adults now. And we certainly see that there are really high rates of substance abuse amongst individuals with anxiety and experiencing anxiety. So let me pull my PowerPoint up here. And so the goals with this are just to help everybody to understand what anxiety is and the components of really good anxiety treatment. Because the great news is, while anxiety is so common, it is highly treatable. I'm going to zip through stuff because we got a lot of information to cover. Some of the stuff I'm going to fly through a little bit. We'll certainly have some time for questions at the end, but let's get rocking. So, as you can see, anxiety disorders are the most common mental health disorders in America. About 40 million American adults are affected by anxiety every year, and that's approximately 18% of the population. According to DSM, which is our diagnostic manual for mental disorders, we have the following anxiety disorders. There's panic disorder, specific phobia, social phobia, generalized anxiety disorder, and then amongst kids, we can also have separation anxiety disorder and selective mutism. But across all of those different diagnostic conceptualizations, there tend to be some common factors with anxiety. Just going to zip through these anxiety statistics. You guys can all kind of come back to this and look through them. The PowerPoint will be available afterwards because there's some good resources and stuff in here as well. But as you can see with this, anxiety and panic are extremely common. Anxiety disorders affect about 25% of children between 13 and 18 years of age. Whole quarter of the 13 to 18-year-old population. If we look at anxiety amongst college students, we see another really high rate, 41.6%. And unfortunately, while anxiety is so common, and we do have great treatment for it, most people do not seek out treatment or effective treatment. So here's just some clinical examples. These are all kids that I've seen, all true clinical examples of what anxiety can present. Like 10-year-old Corey stepped off a bus and felt his heart race, his stomach got nauseous, and he began having difficulty breathing. He got dizzy and his chest hurt, so he called his friend to get the principal. By the time the principal came, Corey was sitting on a chair and his face was very red. He was breathing really fast. He said everything was spinning, told the principal he thought he was dying and to call an ambulance. By the time that Corey arrived at the hospital, he was scared, but all of the other symptoms were gone. And routine medical tests showed nothing. Another example, 14-year-old Alexis. She's missed 8 days of school the past month. The reason is that every day she's ready to get going, she feels nauseated, starts to gag, her stomach gets upset, she gets a headache and acid reflux, her heart races, and she starts shaking. She's had this condition since getting over the flu a little over a month ago. Alexis used to enjoy school and was very active in sports, and she's suddenly become increasingly irritable and withdrawn. Ramil, age 16, was in his math class. All of a sudden, he felt like he had to get out or he was going to go nuts or lose control. Ramil felt his body explode with terrifying sensations. He started breathing hard, felt his heart race, became hot and sweaty, and was trembling. He raised his hand to tell his teacher that he had to leave. When the teacher said no, Ramil started screaming that he was going anyway. He knocked over his desk and then slammed the door so hard they could hear it upstairs. By the time he ended up at the vice principal's office, it was over and he was sorry, but he'd ended up with a detention. 9-year-old Jessica has been to the family doctor 6 times in the last 2 weeks. She's insisted that her mother take her ever since she had a dizzy spell, felt like her stomach was turning inside out and couldn't breathe. She thought she was going to die. The family doctor couldn't find anything, but she believes that the doctor missed something. Jessica becomes unable to focus on her schoolwork because she's worried about her body sensations and fearful that she'll have an attack. She begins to miss more and more school with assorted physical complaints and becomes increasingly oppositional. So this is what anxiety presents as. And it's also really common for an anxiety disorder to accompany depression, eating disorders, substance abuse, or other anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders can also coexist with physical issues such as cancer, heart disease, extremely common. So what is effective treatment for anxiety? Well, these are our options. We have cognitive behavioral therapy. As I said before, that is the gold standard of treatment for anxiety. We have behavioral therapy, relaxation therapy, and medication. I'll talk more about medication as we get going, but what we're going to primarily focus on today is helping everyone to understand how we can effectively treat anxiety and the components of cognitive behavioral therapy. So I learned the panic inoculation treatment. It is a cognitive behavioral technique that not only addresses panic, but the gamut of presenting anxiety symptoms. And there are 5 primary components to that treatment. The first is psychoeducation, right? Knowing and understanding and learning, really getting what anxiety is. Because when we don't understand things, they become a heck of a lot more scary and freaky and mystical to us. 2, breathing retraining. 3, what we call cognitive restructuring, right? Changing thinking. 4th component are behavioral experiments or exposure. And the 5th is what we call relapse prevention. The research behind the panic inoculation treatment was fantastic. About 80% of people who engaged in that treatment saw dramatic improvement in the frequency of panic attacks, their agoraphobic avoidance, and their anxiety symptoms, 80%. So when I meet with families in the initial session, I'll just kind of do a traditional intake, get background information and a mini mental status exam, but I also offer what I call the miracle question. I ask this of every client and every family when I start because it's really important for me, because I can tell you, people come in all the time with very abstract and ambiguous goals. I want to be less depressed. I want to be less anxious. I want to feel better about myself. Well, understandably, I could ask 10 people what that means and get a lot of different responses. So this miracle question really helps me to clearly understand what people want, and it helps us to identify change. I'll go back to that in just a second. And then I even begin psychoeducation in the first session, even in the intake session. A handout that I have on anxiety and panic for the older kids, adolescents, and adults. And then I offer this dragon metaphor. Now, the Disappear Fear program incorporates a lot of metaphor, because through metaphor, it just kind of helps us to understand more complicated things in more understandable terms. So that miracle question is, in a nutshell, imagine that a miracle happens while you're sleeping tonight. And everything that you're coming here for, everything that you'd like to get from our time together is just all of a sudden miraculously better overnight while you're sleeping. When you wake up tomorrow morning and everything is all better, how are you going to know? What's it going to look like? And so that question helps us to break things down to really clear and specific and concrete goals. Because if we have clear and concrete goals, like doing more things with friends, going out to the movie theater, eating out at a restaurant, right? Those are much easier for us to evaluate our progress. And an absolute important and essential first step of any type of treatment is to start to create an image or get a vision in the individual's mind as to where they want to be and where they want to get to. Because if we don't have a clear vision of where we want to get to, then it's a lot harder for us to come up with a path in order to get there. So this miracle question helps me with both of those. Then, as I said, I give a handout prior to or after the first session. The purpose of the handout is to define panic and anxiety terms, and then we always come back and we go through that stuff in depth in therapy. Talks about the function of anxiety and panic, and really helps to make clients become an expert on anxiety and panic. I tell my clients all the time, whether they're six-year-olds or whether they're 45-year-olds, by the time we're done with this, you will be an expert on anxiety. You will know more about anxiety than most psychologists know about anxiety when we get done with this. Because when we know and understand things, it becomes a lot less scary. So on that sheet right there, there's a link that you can go check. You can find the handout that I use that just kind of has all of this stuff. If for whatever reason you're having trouble and that link doesn't work, don't hesitate to email me. So then, as I said, I offer a few metaphors out. The dragon metaphor I borrowed from a book called The Anxiety Cure for Kids by Spencer DuPont, a lot of DuPonts, right? So with this, here's what I say about the dragon. You may not know this, but you got a little dragon that lives in the back of your mind. You've got one, I've got one, everybody has a dragon. Now, since they live in your mind, there's nothing they can do to hurt you, right? They can't scratch you with fire, they can't burn you with, or they can't scratch you with their claws or burn you with fire because they're in your mind. But what's really interesting about these dragons is there's only one thing that they can eat. The only thing in the whole world they can eat, fear and worries. So imagine if the only thing you could eat in the whole world was corn dogs. Would you have to get really good at finding corn dogs? Absolutely. Since the dragon can only eat fears and worries, what does it want from you? It wants you scared and worried all the time, 24/7. Your dragon doesn't want you going to school. Your dragon doesn't want you hanging out with friends. Your dragon doesn't want you playing sports. Your dragon wants you sitting around worried all the time, 24/7, because then it's got like old country buffet, right? It's got as much as it wants to eat whenever it wants to. Now, but since the dragon can't hurt you, it's got to get really sneaky, right? So it's there in the back of your mind, watching, waiting, learning, figuring out the things that make you afraid. And then once they find that stuff out, they start messing with you, putting those intrusive thoughts in your mind, like there's a monster in your closet, or a bad guy's going to break into the house, or lightning's going to hit your house and it's going to burn down. Because if the dragon puts those thoughts in your head, does it get you scared? Absolutely. And so then the more fear that you give the dragon, they gobble it up, and then they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And even if they get ginormous, again, there's nothing they can do to hurt us, but we start getting the intrusive thoughts, just being bombarded by these intrusive thoughts. So our goal is we are going to make you a dragon master. Right? We're going to look at, okay, whether these things that you're afraid of, whether it's really something you need to be afraid of, or whether your dragon's messing with you in some way. And so we inform about the dragon, and then we want to start learning about the dragon. right? So then this is an important piece where we start to track the worries. I just have a really simple worry log that I give out. And kids, adults, families just kind of track the worries. It's, I have it here. No, it's just simple. It just adds the date, time, whatever the situation is. And then we want to break it down to the specific fear or worry, right? The specific threat. And then I just have them rated either 0 to 10, or like it says on this slide, with either like small, medium, or large stickers for small, medium, or large fears. So this is an important first component to treatment, is starting to identify the fears and getting the individual to open up. Right? Anxiety, people with anxiety do a great job of masking anxiety. They don't want other people to know they're anxious. So sometimes, even if we as parents know our kids have fears and worries, sometimes what we're aware of is only the tip of the iceberg. So a really important first step is to just say, okay, you know what, we can talk about this. Let's get these worries out. I often say there's 3 simple keys to chilling out, whether it's anxiety, whether it's anger, whether it's frustration, right? 3 simple keys. The first one is understanding our emotions or our experiences and being able to communicate it, right? This helps us with that and gets the communication ball rolling. And then when we clearly know what those fears and worries are, then it's easier for us to, when we get into the cognitive piece of things, start to challenge them. So this is the education piece, right? We'll go over some anxiety definitions and help to understand really clearly what anxiety is and how anxiety and stress are different things. We talk about the 3 systems of anxiety and the theoretical model of panic, which we'll be going into right now. So it's important anytime that we're working on something that we can clearly understand and identify and define what it is. Because I can tell you, people misunderstand anxiety and misunderstand stress all the time. And often people use those terms interchangeably. While they are 2 different constructs, they certainly do have the capacity to, overlap and impact one another. But here's the definition that I use for stress. Stress is just the general response we have to perceived pressures and demands. I hate to break it to you, but everybody who's watching this today is going to have stress, because you'll always have pressures and demands. And even good things can create stress because they add to the pressures and demands we have in life, right? Things like, getting a job promotion, going to college, having a baby, and being in a relationship, playing a sport. Those are all generally positive things, but do they add to the pressures and demands that we have in life? Absolutely. So they can add to increasing our stress. And the metaphor that I use to help people understand stress is I say, think of stress as like going to a picnic, right? Like a potluck. You go and everybody brought something. So you got this huge table and there's all kinds of food there. So you grab your paper plate and you go, you start loading up. There's a cheeseburger, it's chicken and corn on the cob. And then, there's like 40 salads, right? Like potato salad and tuna salad and ramen salad and 7-layer salad. And keep loading up on your plate. Eventually you're going to run out of space on your plate. It's kind of like this with life, right? Sometimes we have just a little bit on our plate. Sometimes we have a lot on our plate. If we have too much on our plate, what do we call that? Sometimes we say we're stressed out, we're overwhelmed. There's just too much on our plate. So if that is the case, and in life you just do have a lot of stuff on your plate, well, what can you do? Well, I don't know. I tell you, here's what I know about stress. Sometimes we can just let go of things, right? You're never going to eat the 7-layer salad anyhow, so why put it on your plate? Sometimes we do this in life. Sometimes we take things on that we're just better off letting go. Sometimes we even take on other people's stresses when we just have too much stuff on our own going on. So sometimes we can let go of things. If we do a good job with things like executive functioning, like with time management and prioritizing things, that helps us deal with our stress, right? Like, okay, I'm going to wait on the chicken until after I get done with the cheeseburger. I'm going to take care of the cheeseburger first, then I can go back for that. Effectively solving problems helps us to remove things from our plate, right? We solve a problem, we get it off our plate. And I'm guessing you guys usually typically feel good when you solve a problem. Well, me too. And I also feel good when I eat cheeseburgers. So solving the problem is kind of like eating the cheeseburger, right? You get it off your plate, but you feel good about it. The only other thing that I can think of, other than trying to balance that stress with healthy habits, is asking for help or support. So that's what I say about stress. Now, stress, as I said, and anxiety are different things, but they do overlap. If we have really significant anxiety, it's like a watermelon on our plate. We have a hard time even dealing with any of the other stressors that we have in life. But what is anxiety? Anxiety is a natural, normal, and built-in alarm system for dealing with perceived future threat or danger. So you guys see that I have this term perceived kind of highlighted in these definitions. Well, understandably, perceived just means the way that we look at something, right? Like we're all looking at my phone. Do we all perceive the same thing? No, I'm looking at the screen, you guys are looking at the back. Doesn't mean that either of us is necessarily wrong, but we're just perceiving it or seeing it in a different way. And so anxiety is natural. Mother Nature gave it to us. We would not be alive as a species if we didn't have this alarm system. It's normal. Everybody has it. And it's been built in since the day that you were born. Anxiety is your body's alarm system. What panic is an alarm response to react to perceived immediate threat or danger. So if you look at the difference between the definitions of anxiety and panic, you're going to see that anxiety is future-based. It's anticipatory, right? We perceive something as dangerous or threatening happening down the road. But if that threat becomes substantial and immediate, like a saber-toothed tiger busting through the door right now, then that alarm system goes off full bore and we panic. Now, what this alarm system is simply is hardwired to all of us. We have our central nervous system, which is composed of our brain and spinal cord. It's kind of important stuff. In fact, it's central to everything you experience and all you do, which is why it's called the central nervous system. There's a branch of that central nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system has two components to it that are complementary. They work opposite one another, but they complement each other. One is our sympathetic nervous system. That is our body's built-in alarm system. Sympathetic nervous system, we also have another name for it, which I'm sure everyone's heard. We call it the fight or flight response. Right? It's most appropriate to call it the fight, flight, or freeze response. If that's too many F's, I get tongue-tied and then F's come out. So I just say fight or flight response. Works much better, especially working with kids. So fight or flight response, sympathetic nervous system, alarm system, same thing. Its job is to prepare us for action. So if we perceive something as threatening, sympathetic nervous system response is automatic. We do not have control over it. If you perceive a threat, it's automatically going to go off. The good news is we do have control over the opposite system, which is our parasympathetic nervous system. And its job is to chill us out. That's our body's relaxation response. We don't have control over this one. Thankfully, we do have control over this one, and we're going to use it to our advantage. Then sometimes people have heard the term panic disorder. It's just a learned pattern of false alarms, right? If somebody has a panic attack, it makes it more likely that they're going to have a later panic attack. We'll get into that a little bit more as we go. And then an important thing for us to address is this great big word at the bottom called agoraphobia. Well, all agoraphobia really is avoidance. And avoidance tends to become the most functionally impairing piece of anxiety. So agoraphobia is just a method for coping with false alarms by avoiding situations. But avoidance is a natural response to anxiety. It makes sense that if we thought something was dangerous or threatening, that we would avoid it. Right? For example, if every time you stepped out your front door, there's a great big biker dude out there that slaps you across the face, would you keep walking out the front door? No, of course not. But if you just cowered in your house and you didn't do anything about it, it would really mess up your life, right? Especially if the dude just, decided to leave after about 15 minutes and was gone. So avoidance is understandable, but it is a really functionally impairing part of anxiety. And what is a common method of avoidance? Using drugs or alcohol. So when our sympathetic nervous system goes off, there is the physical system. The physical system that occurs with anxiety is, oops, let me go back one before I pull that up. It's all of the physical sensations, all of the physical changes that just naturally occur in our body for fight or flight response to go off. So understandably, what are the symptoms that we experience with anxiety? Well, our heart starts to beat faster. It automatically does, because Mother Nature automatically made it start beating faster to move blood through the major muscles of our legs so we can run away, or our arms so we could pop the saber-toothed tiger in the nose. So our heart automatically starts beating faster. Our respiration increases, right? We start breathing faster, and we tend to start breathing more shallow. We take in oxygen, we give off carbon dioxide. Plants and trees take in carbon dioxide, give off oxygen. It's a very nice cycle, right? But if for whatever reason we start breathing too fast and shallow, and we suck in a bunch of oxygen and we're not giving off the same rate of carbon dioxide, it leads to a condition in our blood called respiratory alkalosis, which is not dangerous, but that is what hyperventilation is. When we hyperventilate, we feel dizzy, lightheaded, feel like things aren't real. And sometimes, believe it or not, the trick is when we're hyperventilating that we feel like we're not getting enough oxygen, when in fact we're getting too much oxygen. And if you ever seen like in the shows with the paper bag, right, it works because not only are you regulating how much you're taking in, you're breathing out, but then, the bag has carbon dioxide in it. So we end up breathing that in instead. So it helps to regulate things. So breathing increases, muscle tension increases. This is what leads us to be kind of shaky when we get anxious and nervous about stuff, right? Sometimes we also notice like pain in our bodies in certain spots. We start to radiate even more tension in our neck and in our shoulders. So that radiates to our head and can create a lot of tension headaches. Again, the muscle tension is just a natural response to the fight or flight response. Other things that happen. Well, our pupils can sometimes dilate with sympathetic nervous system response, which can make our vision seem a little bit funky. Often people complain of like stomach nausea. Well, there's a reason for that too. You only have so much blood in your body at any given time, right? Mother Nature had to figure out where to get this blood from to move to the major muscles. So she's like, I got it. Do human beings really need to digest a turkey sandwich when a saber-toothed tiger is chasing after them, or do they just need to get out of there? They obviously just need to get out of there. So she's like, I got it. We're going to shut digestion down, move blood from the stomach to the major muscles, and there you go. I got the blood I need for survival. And then when digestion shuts down too, since we digest food with stomach acid, if it's not being used for digestion, sometimes that can lead to like, that what people call a nervous stomach or acid reflux type of situation. Our salivary glands also shut down with sympathetic nervous system response, which can lead to dry mouth. All of these changes in our bodies take energy. A byproduct of energy is heat. So our bodies heat up, right? Sometimes we then sweat. We might notice numbness or tingling in our extremities because blood's flowing out of those tiny little capillaries and those little blood vessels to other parts. Sometimes we sweat in response to being hot. So all of these physical things, all the things that you saw in those clinical case examples, all of those sensations that those kids are experiencing, they were real and true sensations. They were triggered by perception of threat, but they were real and true sensations. And this is the really tricky thing about anxiety, because your dragon knows about your alarm system. And if your dragon can get you scared and then it sets off your alarm system, not only are you stuck having these intrusive negative thoughts that are scary in your head, but what is your body telling you? Your alarm system's going off. It's telling you that something is wrong. So those are the major physical changes, but Mother Nature also made mental changes happen to help us with survival and the fight or flight response. So what do? We start to worry mentally, right? And what is worry? Worry is a form of mental rehearsal, right? If we perceive a threat and then we start to worry and we're able to come up with a plan or an effective way to deal successfully with that threat, well, that is adaptive. That's a good thing, right? But if we've over-exaggerated the threat or there's no true threat and then we spend all this time worrying, that doesn't work so well for us, because worry is not only distressing, but also we get stuck inside our heads then. And the more we get stuck inside our heads, the harder it is for us to focus on what's going on around us. And so ultimately, though, like I said, worry is just a form of mental rehearsal. And later on, we work to replace that with another form of mental rehearsal, which we call visualization. Another thing that happens to us mentally is our focus tends to narrow in on the threat, right? And if we're constantly looking for a threat, we're eventually going to find a threat. And too often, especially when it involves panic, the threat and the focus becomes internal. We start to kind of like get really hyper vigilant or hypersensitive to our bodies and our body sensations. And then sometimes that can even just automatically trigger an anxiety response or a panic attack. We'll speak more about that as we get going. And then the third system of anxiety is the behavioral system. These are the behaviors that we feel, right? That we feel like we need to do. So the physical system and the mental system work together in a protective fashion. So what do we feel like we want to do? Well, we feel like we want to get out of there, right? We have this escape tendency. We got to get out of the situation. And then, as I said, it tends to lead to avoidance. When people have had anxiety and anxiety attacks and panic attacks, well, what do? They start to avoid more and more, and their comfort zone shrinks. The comfort zone shrinks. As anxiety intensifies, our comfort zone with things starts to shrink. And so a great tactic for us to then decrease anxiety is by getting out and expanding our comfort zone. I hope all that makes sense. Hey, it's not psychology, it's physiology. This is just the way that we're made. Mother Nature made us this way, and we wouldn't be alive as a species if we weren't built this way and we didn't have our sympathetic nervous system. But sometimes, right, it can get a little haywire. Like kind of like a car alarm. Oh, wait, I think I got a slide coming up after this on that. Let me see. Oh, yep. So we got sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system. Our parasympathetic nervous system is our body's relaxation response. Sympathetic is fight, flight, or freeze. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. We'll talk more about how we're able to kick in that parasympathetic nervous system in just a little bit. So like I was saying, when our alarm system gets a little askew, it's almost like we got to recalibrate the system a little bit, right? Because do car alarms only go off when people are busting in the cars? Of course not, right? Somebody bumps into it, a bird drops a great big present on it. If that's the case, those are false alarms. So we're looking to evaluate, okay, if your alarm system's going off to a true threat, fantastic. We're not going to take away your body's alarm system. You need it. But if it's going off to false alarms, then we want to really kind of like recalibrate that. Take a good look at that and challenge some of that perception of threat. I do like this slide though. One of my coworkers found this and I put it in here. It's awesome. My car would feel scared and alone in the night. Okay, and then another piece of the psychoeducation is to understand what we call our theoretical model of panic. This is it in a nutshell. This is how panic happens. One, we have these things which are physical arousal triggers, right? Hyperventilation, exercise, stress. They're just triggers for physical sensations. Is there anything wrong with that? Absolutely not. This is just how we're made, right? There are things that trigger physical sensations. No problem. However, if we add this part down here, this faulty appraisal of threat, if we believe that there is something dangerous or threatening about those physical sensations, boom, then it's going to lead to panic. And that panic then acts as a trigger for even more physical sensations. And so it kind of can zip down the rabbit hole. I do a ton of work with athletes as well. I've worked with professional athletes. I've worked with Olympic athletes. I've worked with college athletes, high school athletes. I work with youth athletes every day. And typically, athletes are coming in to see me because they're getting stuck with anxiety, right? And then that anxiety tends to spiral and keeps messing with them. We'll talk more about what we do with that, but it tends to follow this type of situation as well, right? If you have a performance situation, you're going to have sympathetic nervous system arousal. But if you notice that sympathetic nervous system arousal, like your heart's beating really fast, and instead of saying, oh boy, I am like so jacked up, I'm so ready for this race today, and you view that and you notice your heart beating faster and you say, oh my gosh, I'm so anxious, this is not going to go well today. Boom, that appraisal of threat then kicks up fight or flight response even more and moves us more into anxiety and panic. And then, especially when we get to the point of having panic attacks and panic disorder, we see that people have developed these panic myths and misinterpretations about things. Like if their heart starts racing, they start to believe that they're having a heart attack. If they get lightheaded or dizzy, they feel and worry like they're going to faint. If they get breathlessness, they feel like they're going to suffocate and die. Lightheadedness often leads people to think like they're having a seizure or they're going to lose control or something's wrong with them. The hyperventilation and body changes, right? Our bodies start to feel a little bit more out of control. So we start to get this perception and this myth that we're going to lose control of ourselves. People with anxiety and panic, often when they experience the anxiety and panic in a car, what do? They pull over and they get worried that they're going to lose control or hurt somebody. And then what happens? They start to avoid driving, stop going places. The stomach distress often leads people to perceive that they're going to vomit. And this is a main reason why I work with kids that have school avoidance, because the most common school avoidance due to anxiety is because of fear of getting sick and vomiting at school. See it every year after we get a bout of the flu. Kids might get sick and then they worry that they're going to get sick at school. So they worry they get sick at school. They wake up in the morning, they're worrying about it. What happens? That triggers the stomach distress because their fight or flight response is going off. Then they don't eat and they want to avoid even more. So you can see how that can get into a really bad cycle. So these are just common panic myths and misinterpretations. And the good thing is if we've gotten to the point of communicating about this and individuals are able to communicate to me what they're believing and what's going on with them, well, hey, then it's much easier for us to challenge it and do some work with that. So if I had to mix up a panic attack, I would only need 2 ingredients: uncomfortable physical sensations, and then the belief that something bad would happen because of those physical sensations. For example, let's say you and I are both running late to an appointment, and we get to the appointment, we had to run up like a flight of stairs, and we get there, we get into the doctor's office, and we sit down and breathing faster. And let's say I noticed that you notice that you're breathing faster, and you know that you're hot and sweaty and you have a hard time catching your breath, and you say, oh man, geez, I'm getting out of shape, I got to get to the gym. Well, what emotion is that going to trigger? Maybe, you know, a little disappointment. It might even be motivating to get going and working out some more. However, if I get there and notice the exact same sensation, say, oh my gosh, my heart's beating really fast and I can't catch my breath, I'm having a heart attack. Boom, is that going to lead to anxiety and panic? Absolutely. Those two ingredients. And one thing to keep in mind is Mother Nature had to make this alarm system uncomfortable, because if it wasn't uncomfortable, we wouldn't listen to it. Like imagine if your fight or flight response went off, like saber-tooth tiger's there, and you're like, it feels like it does after you eat a hot fudge sundae. You'd be like, oh man, this is great. Like, we would have all been gobbled up by saber-tooth tigers a long time ago. And Mother Nature had to make it fast. You would not want an alarm system so slow that you actually had to turn it on. You want it to be lightning fast. So while anxiety and panic by nature are unpleasant and uncomfortable, they are not harmful or dangerous. They are necessary for our survival and protection, which is exactly what's going on. It's just your body's alarm system. Again, we're not going to take that alarm system away, but we do want to recalibrate it. And as I said, these are some, avoidance is just a natural response to anxiety. And these tend to be some of the indicators that there might be avoidance going on. Right? If kids or adults just develop certain rules, like I'll only go there if I'm with this person, or I don't go to birthday parties, or I won't go on the bus, but I'll go to school if I'm driven to school, right? You start to pick up on these little things that indicate that there's these rules that kind of tie around the avoidance, because at the heart of the avoidance, understandably, is perception of threat. And then that avoidance and the shrinking of comfort zone is the stuff that really significantly starts to affect individuals' functioning and their relationships. So an anxiety response is no more than sympathetic nervous system arousal. And when I say the cognitive attribution, it's the thought or belief that we have about that arousal. If we notice that's, because anytime you're in a performance situation, whether it's a sporting event, whether it's taking a test, whether it's a job interview, whether it's meeting new people, anytime you are in a performance situation, you are going to have some sympathetic nervous system arousal. But if you notice that sympathetic nervous system arousal and you think there's something dangerous or threatening or bad about it, boom, well then it's going to explode even more. And then our attribution ties into the emotion we label it. And we say, oh, I'm anxious or I'm nervous or something bad's going to happen. Going back to athletes, I work with a ton of swimmers. I'll usually ask the swimmers, I'm like, okay, when they come in and they're complaining about anxiety negatively impacting their performance. And I'll say, okay, well, how do you know you're anxious? The vast majority of responses have to do with the physical sensations. The swimmers will say, well, my heart starts beating really fast. I get all shaky before the meet. I get hot. Okay. And then what happens after you notice those sensations, which are just sympathetic nervous system arousal? What happens you notice after this? Well, then I think, boy, I'm anxious. This isn't going to go well. It's not going to be a good performance. And then after you notice that and you think it's going to go bad, does that lead to the emotion of anxiety or fear? Yes. And then I'll ask him, I'll say, okay, back before you ever had anxiety, back when swimming was just fun, did you ever notice those sensations before a meet? Right? Back when swimming was just fun, you ever notice your heart would start beating a little faster, you get kind of shaky and restless? Of course you did. Except back then, when swimming was just fun instead of anxiety provoking, when you noticed those sensations, you labeled it a different emotion. You noticed those sensations and you said, I'm excited, or I'm jacked up, I'm so ready to go here. Right? And by labeling it that emotion, excitement, instead of anxiety, you see it takes a very different path and doesn't go down that rabbit hole. So part of this has to do with some failures with the English language. Now, this word feeling, which we say all the time, is one problem with anxiety, because in the English language, we use feeling way too broadly. Sometimes we use the word feeling this way. We say, I feel my heart beating faster. I feel nauseous in my stomach. I feel hot, right? Well, what's feeling there? Physical sensations. So sometimes we use the word feeling to describe physical sensations. Sometimes we use the word feeling this way. I feel sad. I feel scared. I feel embarrassed. Well, what's feeling there? It's an emotion. So sometimes we use the word feeling to describe sensations, sometimes emotions. Sometimes we use the word feeling this way. Say like, I feel like something bad is going to happen. I feel like I can't do it. I feel like this is too much for me. Well, what's feeling there? It's not a sensation. It's not emotion. It is a thought. It's not that I feel like something bad is going to happen. It's I think something bad is going to happen, right? It's not I feel like I can't do this. It's I think I can't do it. And the weird thing about that is just by replacing the word thought with feeling, what ends up happening is it's almost like we give it more power. It's almost like the sense that we have, right? Like that things are going to go awry. Because if we just say it's a thought, well, then it's easier for us to just change that thought or reformulate a thought or put a different one in. But if we go with the word feeling, instead, it just kind of tends to make it stick a little bit more. Oop, forgot I had those little things there. Okay, so now we've done the education piece of things, right? So then we're going to go into breathing retraining because we want a tool that will help us to be able to settle down and chill out, right? As I said before, we don't have control over our sympathetic nervous system. If you perceive threat, it's automatically going to go off. But what we do have control over, our parasympathetic nervous system. That is our body's relaxation response. So, as we talked about before, hyperventilation is when you take in more oxygen and in not getting off a commensurate amount of carbon dioxide. One thing that we can do to help see how well we're breathing is there's just simple breathing assessments that we can do. Lay down on the ground, put a hand on your chest and a hand on your stomach. The one that you want moving is the one on your stomach, because when we're diaphragmatic breathing, we're taking that breath nice and deep inside. But unfortunately, as we get stressed and as we get anxious and there's pressures and demands, we tend to become more shallow chest breathers. And while our brainstem controls our breathing, which is great because it's good that we don't have to think to breathe, otherwise we'd be all dead in our sleep. Just because our breathing is automatically being controlled does not mean that we're doing a healthy job of breathing. And it often takes a lot of reflection and understanding and awareness of ourselves to just be able to realize, oh, geez, I'm so ramped up right now. I just got to take a couple deep breaths. So there's a number of breathing pacers that are out there. I use the M-Wave HeartMath product with clients. It's a bit pricey, but it's a great biofeedback product. I like it because since it is biofeedback, it shows us kind of like what's going on inside our body, and it's much more convincing. But there's tons of free breathing apps that are out there. The Calm app, which is backed by LeBron James, that's out there. It has a free breathing pacer. There's the Pacifica one. There's another one called BreathWorks. No problem at all. Just look in your app store and put in like breathing pacer. But here's just a couple of examples of some that are out there as well. Because here's how it works. When we breathe into our lungs, correct? Right? And when we breathe into our lungs expand. When we breathe out, our lungs contract, right? Just by this little Hoberman sphere. Underneath our lungs, right about here, is a band of muscles called our diaphragm, right? And when we do a good job of deep breathing, our lungs kind of tickle that diaphragm, right? And then the diaphragm activates our vagus nerve, which is one of the largest nerves in our body, hardwired to our heart and our cardiovascular system, and helps kick in parasympathetic nervous system response and chill us out. Does some other things as well in terms of increasing oxygen levels to our brain and things like that, but this isn't psychology. This is physiology. It's just the way it works. So I'll often ask people, I'm like, okay, well, what have people told you in order to how to chill out? Because the second key to chilling out, we said the first one was understanding emotions and being able to communicate our experiences. The second one is diaphragmatic breathing. It's just the way we're built. So I'll ask kids, they usually say, yeah, people have said deep breathing. Like, okay, does it help? Well, yeah, sometimes it helps, but sometimes it's really hard to do when I get really worked up. Like, okay, well, and to the kids who say it doesn't work, I say, well, then you're either not a human being or you're not doing it right. So we just have to train you on that. Because I just read an article in Golf Digest. In the last Golf Digest, it was the psychologist in there talking about how even the PGA players sometimes don't do breathing well. You'll see them breathing over the 4-foot putt to try to win the tournament. But the time for them to start breathing isn't when they're standing over that putt. It's when they're walking up the fairway to get to that putt. So breathing retraining, an extremely important part. And like I said, basic physiology, there are a number of things that are out there to help promote breathing and being able to master that as a strategy for chilling out. Then the third phase of our treatment is what we call cognitive restructuring. It's getting at those thoughts, those negative intrusive thoughts and those dragon tricks, and checking to see whether those are really things we need to be afraid of or whether we're making any type of thinking errors or exaggerations. An activity that I like to do, it's called Brain Channels. It was from a book, The Handbook for Helping Kids with Anxiety and Stress, called Frank and Frank. I just have kids draw 3 TVs, adults as well. Again, I use the same stuff with adults. And in one TV, they draw a storm cloud, like a thundercloud with rain and lightning. In another TV, they have put a great big sun. And in the third TV, a rainbow, just like these pictures here. And I say stormy channel. Stormy channel is about negative thinking. That's when our brain is getting stuck with negative thinking. Sunny channel, that's just seeing things clearly. It's just reality. It is what it is. And then rainbow channel thinking is when we engage in positive thinking. It's not necessarily happiness, right? Because happiness is an emotion, but it's positive thinking. And the trick is, it's a lot easier to think positive when everything's going great. It can be a lot harder to think positive when bad things happen to us or when we face challenges. But I don't know, aren't those really the most important times to think positively? I sure think so. So how can you possibly do it? Like, what are ways for us to think positively? Well, what rainbow channel thinking? Well, one way we can think positive, even when bad things happen or challenges, we can look at what we have to be thankful for, the good things that we have in our lives. We can be hopeful, right? I heard on the radio, listen to something like hope was the word of 2020, right? We all have had to be hopeful that we get through this pandemic and things get back to normal. And another way for us to be rainbow channel thinkers is to have what we call having a growth mindset, right? Viewing how overcoming challenges makes us stronger, tougher, right? We adapt to things better. So thoughts, I can tell you, I work with people in their thoughts every single day. They are really powerful. They can't make things happen, right? Like I can't just all of a sudden think 10 grand in my pocket. But what thoughts are really powerful for what they do is thoughts powerfully affect our emotions. Thoughts and emotions are closely intertwined. And if I asked you, how many thoughts would you guess that you have in a day? Well, it's been done. There's been research that has estimated that the average person has between 70,000 and 100,000 thoughts in a day. That's a lot of thoughts. And so if you do the math, well, if you take 24 by 60 by 60, you come up with 86,400 seconds a day. And if you take out maybe 5-6 hours when we're unconscious, when we're sleeping, well, clearly we average more than a thought a second. Thoughts are constantly changing. And if our thoughts are constantly changing, then we have the capacity to be able to challenge and change our thoughts. Just to differentiate between stormy channel and sunny channel. So think about it when you sometimes get stuck with negative thinking. You know, if you think about it, if you have the thought like, oh, I'm going to mess this up and everybody's going to laugh at me, or I can't do this, this is too hard, or I'm useless, or nobody loves me. If you have those negative thoughts, what emotions do they lead to? Right? If you think about it, all the negative emotions that we experience, fear, depression, sadness, anger, frustration, guilt, jealousy, aren't all of those negative emotions because of negative thinking? And then when you're in stormy channel doing that negative thinking and stuck with those negative emotions, do you do the best job of problem solving? Not typically, right? When we are anxious, we avoid. When we're depressed, we shut down. When we're angry, we tend to lash out. So stormy channel does not work well for us. Now, most people go into stormy channel sometimes, but you don't want to stay stuck there. Right? The good news is we have these other channels to switch into. Now, sunny channel isn't that everything is great, right? But we're just seeing things clearly for how they are, right? Like, for example, if you want to get better at something, what do you have to do? You have to practice, right? This is the first year in like 14 years I haven't coached basketball. I've done a lot of basketball coaching, and I can tell you, as a basketball coach, sometimes I would have kids come to practice in stormy channel. They were all like, you know, this is dumb. I don't like this offense. I'm not getting enough playing time. If they'd come in stormy channel, I would not get a great effort out of them. And even if they didn't necessarily want to be there or thought it was great, if they were even there in sunny channel, they're just saying, okay, well, if I want to get better, I got to practice. I would get more out of them in practice. So that activity just helps us to learn and understand some things about our brain and our thinking and how our thoughts impact our emotions. And now what's really cool is we have this ability now with technology to be able to look at our brains in real time, right? Back when I was first learning about the brain, you were told that you have all these hundreds of millions of brain cells and you just use a small amount of them and over time they die. Well, now we have a different theory of the brain. We know that our brain is constantly changing, right? We call it neuroplasticity. The brain people will tell you, your brain is an organ, but it functions like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. And this has some important ramifications for even things like managing anxiety and emotions. Because we won't have time today to go into the whole way that the brain and that neurons work, but ultimately, your neurons form networks. And those networks, tell you all that you experience, everything you see, feel, hear, taste, touch, all your mood, your sleep cycle, your appetite, everything, even how you're thinking, right? And so if we can, the more we practice things, right, the stronger those networks become. And so here's some examples we have about how powerful this neuroplasticity stuff can be. Now, the reason that you are even seeing me right now is because light is reflecting upon the lens of your eye, which is causing a neural network to go to the parts of your brain, to your thalamus, and then to your occipital lobe to tell you what you see. If we put a patch over your eye for the next 9 months, when we take that patch off, are you going to see as clearly out of the eye? No. And we didn't damage it with a hot poker or damage the hardware, but by not providing stimulation, that neural network starts to weaken. And then once we start providing stimulation back to it, it will get stronger again, right? So think about this in terms of thinking style, right? I work with adults who have been anxious and depressed for years, right? Think of the mental exercise and the neural training that they're doing, right? That negative thinking neural network is just strong and constantly stimulated. I say it like, as the older clients I work with, I'll say, okay, if I give you 2 dumbbells to carry around for the next 9 months, and every time you have a positive thought, you curl the right arm. Every time you have a negative thought, you curl the left arm. What's going to happen after 9 months? Right? The depressed, anxious people, they're going to have a jacked up left arm, right? That bicep is going to be ginormous because, that's the stimulation that you're continuing to provide to your brain. Then we have one of my former professors at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Richard Davidson. He's pictured there with the Dalai Lama. He's got some amazing work using brain imaging to look at how certain things impact the development and the neural structure of our brain. So he was presenting, and he's really big into meditation. So he was presenting at an international conference about the impact of meditation on our brain and what he was able to get from neural imaging. Because now, like I said, we have the technology where we can have you do an activity and we can look and see what's going on in your brain at that time under like a SPECT scan or an fMRI. And so he was out presenting at an international conference about this. And then the Dalai Lama kind of got really interested in this and started chatting with Richard Davidson. He's like, wow, it'd be really cool if I could send like some of my monks to Madison and let's check out what they look like, what their brains look like in comparison to others. So, I don't know if you guys have seen Caddyshack, but the Dalai Lama, flowing robes, bald, striking, right? So these monks go rolling into Madison in the robes, right? And they undergo this neural imaging with Davidson, and they find that their brains are different from the rest of us. Where we were able to stimulate things that created negative emotion in others, their brains just didn't light up the same way. And they weren't born that way, right? But the way that they live their life through meditation and service from others, it, in essence, made them incapable of experiencing negative emotions. How wild is that? We also know from what happens with a stroke that neuroplasticity exists. Because what happens in a stroke, right? There's a blood clot or oxygen's not getting to the brain for some reason, and that part of the brain dies. Those neurons are not coming back. And so then that individual goes through speech therapy and occupational therapy and physical therapy. And what happens? We get some of that functioning back again. It may not exactly be as smooth as it was before, but we get that back. Now, those neurons are dead. They're not coming back. Do you know what happens? Your brain remaps. Neurons that were responsible for other things will start to take that functioning on the more that we exercise with that stuff. So just some examples of neuroplasticity, because here's the way that I put it out. If we know that this is the way that the brain works, well, how is it that the way that we think does not over the long term start to impact and become more crystallized in us. So people who tend to be more optimistic and rainbow channel thinkers and seeing the world through rose-colored glasses, that's the stimulation that they're providing to their brain. So it frames their experiences with the world. They just start to see the world in a different way, through a different lens, right? A rose-colored lens. Whereas the sunny channel people, they're seeing it through a clear lens, and the stormy channel people, they're seeing the world through crap-colored glasses. So yeah, rainbow thinking. If you want to be happier, stop thinking stormy thoughts, start thinking rainbow thoughts. So one thing that I do, not only with kids, but also adults, is we talk about having rainbow thinking cards. Each index card, simple as having index cards and writing positive thoughts on them, right? We see this. There are a ton of athletes that do this. You don't have to look far to see athletes that have their mirror pasted with positive affirmations and positive thoughts about things. I'm trying to think, there was a movie I watched not too long ago with Reese Witherspoon in, and she was like a softball player on the women's Olympic team and the national team, and they showed her like mirror, and it was just constant. It was just chock full of positive affirmations. And see, the reason I ask people to fill these out is because sometimes if we have something concrete and tangible, it just helps it to stick with us a little bit more. Kind of like, I'm sure all of you have used flashcards at some point to learn something. If you think back, it kind of helped, didn't it? And it's not that you took the cards on the test with you, but just by having those and going over them, it just helped it to stick with you a little bit more. So there are many different types of like positive affirmation cards and stuff like that that are available on Amazon. You can make your own. I really implore people to use this. And when we start talking about experiments, I'll start talking about how the rainbow thinking cards were integral in terms of me working with my daughter over some anxiety. So then we also want to engage in this cognitive restructuring. You want to see if we're making any thinking errors, if there are thinking errors that are leading to us experiencing anxiety, because there are two primary thinking errors that lead to anxiety and panic. One is overestimation. That's when we believe something that something bad is way more likely to happen than it really is. For example, if I'm getting on a plane and I'm sitting next to a woman who's phobic about flying on planes, and as we're on the runway about ready to take off, I ask her how likely she thinks it is that the plane's going to crash. What do you think she's going to tell me? Yeah, like 100%, right? Whereas the actual likelihood is so rare that you could fly every day for the next 567,000 years before you will die in a plane crash. That's how rare it is about dying in a plane crash. But you can see if you think it's 100%, well, that is going to jack up your anxiety. Absolutely. So that's an overestimation thinking error. The second most common thinking error for anxiety is catastrophizing. That's when we believe something would be way worse than it actually is. And this is at the heart of social anxiety. Right? We believe that if we embarrassed ourselves or made a mistake, that it would be the worst thing in the world, where clearly there are a lot of bad things in the world that can happen instead. And a tool that I developed, I call my dragon busting worksheet. It's really great for just going through the structure of it, helps us to understand and see if we're making any of those thinking errors. So this is the dragon busting worksheet. It's just as simple as, okay, when was your dragon messing with you? Yesterday. What were you doing? Woke up, getting dressed, and my stomach started to hurt. How anxious were you? 9. Okay, what was your dragon telling you? Your dragon was telling me that I was going to get sick and throw up on the bus or at school and everybody was going to laugh at me. Okay, great. Good job of identifying that really specifically. And then on this scale here where we see this little dragon, right? You don't have to just use one of those numbers, but I want you to put an X on that, where you think on that line as to when your anxiety was up to a 9, how likely you thought it was that that was going to happen. Oh, I was absolutely convinced it was going to happen. Okay, there's your X. Good. Now we're going to see we got a little scientist dude down here. Now that one, the question's asking, how bad did the dragon make you believe it would be if it happened? So at the time your anxiety was that high, when it was yesterday morning and you were getting dressed, how bad did you think it would be if you threw up on the bus? Oh, that would be horrible. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, we got that. Now we're going to go to the second page. And you'll see up here that there's more dragons and more scientists up here. Now, by this dragon up here, it says, what does your scientist brain tell you about the chances of it happening? All right, we're going to turn on your scientist brain. What do scientists do? Well, scientists have theories, right? They have beliefs about things, and then they gather evidence to see whether those theories are accurate or not. Right? So we're going to turn on your scientist brain. Right? Sometimes scientists will gather evidence by researching things. Sometimes they'll just observe things really clearly, like in a microscope or a bunch of animals or something. And sometimes scientists do experiments to gather evidence. So let's look at the evidence. Let's look at your experience. Let's look at other people's experiences. Let's look at what the research suggests and see how likely it is that you're going to throw up. So when's the last time you threw up, or how many times have you actually thrown up in your life? And a typical response I'll get is 0, 1, maybe 2. And what was going on? Well, I had the stomach flu, or I ate something bad. Okay, well, because those are the 2 primary reasons that we throw up. And so let's evaluate and weigh this evidence. We'll just kind of continue to gather it. Right? And so what does the evidence tell you about the actual likelihood that we won't throw up? Because how many times have you worried about throwing up at school? Oh, like every day. So 20 times, 50 times, 100 times? Yeah, maybe 50. Okay. Well, if you've worried about throwing up at school 50 times and you've never thrown up at school, what is your percent accuracy? Donut, 0. Right? So, okay. So then we have the mark. Oop, so you see that it went way down after turning the scientist brain on. Then what does your scientist brain tell you about how bad it would be? Well, that's where we have a special scale called our how bad would it really be scale. And on here, we just put all kinds of bad things that could happen. It goes from 0 to 100. 100 is the absolute worst thing you could ever imagine happening. For me, I tell them it's like terrorists break into my house to like crucify me, to slowly bleed to death while they like torture and rape and kill my wife and kids. That's my 100. I can't think of anything worse than that. Sometimes it's like maybe a meteor crashing into the earth and everybody dies, but 100's got to be the worst thing you can imagine. And then you start putting things on the scale. Okay, where would you put stubbing your toe? Where would you put getting COVID, getting the stomach flu, mom dying, you being paralyzed, going blind, your best friend moving, losing your phone, right? And then they have to choose. 2 things can't be on the same spot. And so then after we do this and we fill out the scale, where it goes on here is where it goes by this little scientist guy. So where would throwing up at school and being embarrassed be? Well, guess what? It starts to slide down and it goes about there. So then we're going to look, is there a big difference between the 2 dragons? Is there a big difference between the dragon on this page, up by about 90, and this page, oh, about 5? Yes. What does that mean? That means the dragon make you believe it would happen when it most likely won't. That's an overestimation error. Is there a big difference between the scientist on the first page down there at the bottom by the 100? Yep. And the scientist on the second page? Oh, yep, it's about 25. Is that a big difference? Yes. What do you think that means? The dragon made me believe it would be worse than it would be. That's what we call catastrophization thinking error. And so then the important part is, after going through this worksheet, can you switch your brain channel and come up with a better thought, and what would it be? When I get worried, my stomach aches, but I've never thrown up, and it always feels better when I relax and don't think about it. Even if I did get sick at school, everyone would feel bad for me. I'll be fine. I'm smarter than the dragon. If we replace the theory, the belief, the threat on the first page, right? Dragon telling you you're going to get sick and throw up and everyone will laugh at you, with this thought at the second page, then it will not lead to anxiety. That is our tool for challenging thoughts and evaluating evidence with things. Okay, that's the third component, the cognitive restructuring component. Now, then we move into the fourth component, which is behavioral exposure, or what I call experiments. I love this fireside. Professor Gallagher and his controversial technique of simultaneously confronting the fear of heights, snakes, and the dark. Poor dude's like in that box in the dark with snakes hanging out a window. We don't do that. I have never done that, performed that experiment. So then we talk about doing behavioral experiments, and they are absolutely key for eliminating false alarms, expanding comfort zone, and getting over anxiety. Another form of exposure that we do is what we call interoceptive exposure. That's where we help people to habituate to their body sensations. And the panic pill or the caffeine induction, that has to do with that as well, which we'll get to. So I talk about introducing experiment cards, right? We had our rainbow thinking cards. Now these are a little bit different cards. These are our experiment cards. And they're the absolute key to getting over phobias. Simple as this. You have a card or a Post-it, and you think about what a good experiment would be. Then you write what that experiment is on the front half. After you do the experiment, you write what happens on the back. For example, my daughter, when she was younger, went over to a friend's house. She was watching some kids' horror movie. It was called like the Midnight Hour or something. I can't even remember what it was, but there was this like evil possessed doll in this show. Well, my daughter watches this show and she gets scared of the doll. And guess what figures out that she's afraid of the doll? Her dragon. So then her dragon starts messing with her, right? Telling her at night that she's going to wake up and her American Girl doll is not going to be there. It's going to be under her bed, or it's going to do something to her. Well, the dragon tells her that. Is it making her scared? Absolutely. So she gives the dragon that fear, the dragon gobbles it up, and our dragon's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And all of a sudden, I keenly noticed that she keeps coming into our bed at night. And then she's like not going down in the basement anymore, and she's afraid to go up and brush her teeth alone. So I'm like, okay, well, what's going on? She's like, well, I've been having bad dreams. I'm like, oh, okay. All right, well, since I'm a brilliant psychologist, I absolutely know how to fix that. So what did I do? I bribed her. I said, okay, well, if you don't come into our bed tomorrow morning, I'll give you some candy. She's highly motivated by candy. I wake up the next morning, she's not in our bed. I'm like, problem solved. Go walking upstairs, go into her room, she's not there. Walk down the hall and go into her brother's room, she's in with her brother. So clearly the problem wasn't solved, but she was smart enough not to come into our room. So I did have to pay off the candy, but clearly this problem wasn't solved, and it wasn't going to be just solved by bribing. So I'm like, you know what, Mags, I'm going to do the same stuff with you that I do with all of these other kids and people that I work with fear and worries. So she got to make her own, we talked about her dragon. She got to make her own dragon out of model magic. We did the brain. There's a couple of stories I read that go along with things. We did the brain channels activity. She made her rainbow thinking cards. And then we got to the point of doing experiment cards. And I remember to this day what the first one was. It was run into the basement with the dog and get me a soda out of the refrigerator. So we wrote that on the front, run to the basement with the dog and get me a soda. She's like, okay, I think I can do that. She ran down with the dog, got a soda in the refrigerator, came up, and then we wrote on the back what happened. What happened? Nothing. Everything was fine. So then we just started to do a series of these experiments. The next one was walk downstairs with the dog and get me a soda out of the refrigerator. She did that. Guess what happened? Nothing. It was fine. Then it was run downstairs without the dog. Then walk downstairs without the dog. Set the alarm and go play the Wii downstairs, right? We just kept coming up with tons and tons of experiments. And then what happens? She starts to gather all of this evidence, right? She's getting this stack of cards that things are okay. And her fears and worries are going away. Now, then when it got to the point of sleeping in her bed every night, because she was really, really, really scared, we had to supplement it with a couple of other things. So we went through her rainbow thinking cards, and I encouraged her. I'm like, okay, why don't you grab a couple of those, couple really good thoughts that you want to have when you wake up and you're really scared, that you can just keep saying over and over in your mind, almost like a mantra. Because if you can jam those negative thoughts with that, it's more likely that you're just going to be able to fall back to sleep. And then we practiced it by using visualization. I asked her to really get a good picture in her mind, create a movie of herself, waking up, being really scared, using her breathing, using her rainbow channel thinking to jam that thinking, and then getting through it. And you know what? She started to do it, and she did it. And then every morning, like the first morning, she woke up, the first night she woke up, she was terrified. She started to breathe to chill her body out. She had a rainbow thinking. She had a rainbow thought that she just kept saying like a mantra over and over again to jam her thinking. And then she woke up in the morning after falling asleep. We filled out an experiment card. Everything was fine. After the fourth day, she wasn't scared anymore. She had something she wanted to earn, and it had to be like 30 days in a row in order to earn it. She did it, no problem. And I usually offer and encourage, use some positive reinforcement when you're doing the experiments, whether it's like for every 5 experiments, 10 experiments, whatever. Use reinforcement to help to encourage a little bit more motivation with doing it, because the kids and adults are going to be scared, right? Understandably, you're facing your fears, but that is the only way for us to get over our fears, is by facing our fears. And you know, sometimes you bump into, you get a whole bunch of them, but bump into one that's really difficult. That's okay. We just have to be creative about figuring out steps to come up with along the way to get to that spot. We just, you know, we're only bound by our creativity, coming up with gradual steps. In the psychology business, we call this a graded hierarchy of exposures. Right? We come up with ones that are easy to do, and we work our ways up to them that are more difficult. That's just a story I have that helps to understand a little bit more about experiments and exposures. As I said, visualization is a very powerful technique. Hey, the Olympics are on right now. If you watch the Olympics, especially the swimmers, you're not going to have to watch for too long before somebody mentions and shows the swimmers doing visualization, right? The United States Olympic Committee employs a number of sports psychologists, and visualization is something that we really strongly promote because, as I said, we replace the mental rehearsal of worry with the mental rehearsal of visualization. And with visualization, we want to either visualize ourselves getting through a feared situation, because your brain isn't going to distinguish, right? If you can create a good picture in your mind about a feared situation, it's going to kick in sympathetic nervous system response. So then what can you do? You can use your breathing to keep yourself chill, right? And you can picture yourself getting through the situation effectively. Then it's mental rehearsal. It's almost like you've been there before, right? And that can help to break this conditioned response where you just have this sense that things aren't going to go okay. Lots of stuff out there on visualization. There's some things here. If you type in TED Talk and visualization, there's a lot of really great stuff that's out there on it. There's just some additional tactics that I use, especially with kids. Was this thing called Hero Machine. Now, since Flash Player went down, I don't think it still works anymore. But I would just help kids. They develop their hero and come up with a superpower that would help them to defeat their intrusive thoughts. It's just kind of a fun way to help with giving less power to those intrusive thoughts. When we get to the point of compulsions, right? So intrusive thoughts are obsessions. So when we talk about OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, we have intrusive bad thoughts, and then there are behaviors or almost superstitious things that we do in order to ward off those thoughts or to make ourselves feel better, right? And so I call those false helpers, because the compulsions, what they do is they just tend to continue to reinforce the belief that you have something to fear or worry about. Right? So instead, I say, okay, we want to use true helpers instead of false helpers. What are true helpers? Things like your parents, talking to your parents about stuff, or coming to see a therapist, right? Those are true helpers, whereas doing these superstitions are false helpers. Another tactic I use is just a worry box, because at the beginning we had that worry log, remember? And we wanted to talk about the fears and worries. Now, as we move on with things, we want to give them less attention and less focus. So sometimes I'll have kids make a worry box either out of cardboard or out of Model Magic, and then they set up a special worry time. And the worry is just either in a visualization go into the worry box, or you have a worry time, because then when you come back to them later, you don't even need to talk about them or use them. Mindfulness, I'm sure everybody's heard of mindfulness. Mindfulness is absolutely essential as well with managing anxiety. Mindfulness is simply noticing what is happening right now. It's like being a part of your experience in the moment without judging or evaluating it. And anxiety is all about overthinking, judging, and evaluating things. So mindfulness becomes awareness of ourselves, our own internal states, our emotions, our physical sensations, our experiences, right? But it also involves us being aware of what's going on around us. Because as we become better aware and understand ourselves, and we're able to kind of shut down that constant white noise that's going through our minds with anxiety and with the negative thinking, as we use these mindfulness tools, it helps us just be able to settle that down and turn that noise off. Tons of stuff out there on mindfulness. If anyone needs any resources, just let me know. It'd be hard not to find them. Jon Kabat-Zinn is the guru of mindfulness. He's got a great, real brief video on YouTube talking about how if we treat our intrusive thoughts just like soap bubbles, right? To not try to fight against them, not give them too much attention, but just kind of let those intrusive thoughts go. They're eventually just going to go. They're going to go away and disappear, just like soap bubbles do. The soap bubbles like in a bubble and blowing. Then the interoceptive assessment, it's just a series of exercises that we do to help habituate people and get more comfortable with their body sensations. Because unfortunately, when we have anxiety over time, it leads to what we call a conditioned response. If anyone had taken psychology out there, I'm sure a whole bunch of you have, you might remember Pavlov's dog, right? So what happened? Well, Pavlov was a physician who was working with dogs, right? And he noticed that every time he'd walk into the room, the dogs would start to drool. He's like, what the heck is up with that? That's weird. Because dogs will automatically and reflexively drool if you put meat in front of them, right? They can't control themselves. They'll reflexively drool. But dogs don't just reflexively drool when people walk in a room. So Pavlov's like, what? I think I'm a great big steak, or what's going on? Well, over time, he realized that there was a bell on the door. And over time, after repeated pairing with the meat coming in and the bell ringing, the meat got paired with the bell, and the dogs would start to drool to the meat. We call that a conditioned or a learned response. When they drool to the bell, right? That's a learned response. It doesn't usually happen. An unlearned or unconditioned response is the dog's drooling to the meat because that is reflexive, right? So over time, especially if something is a really powerful experience, sometimes it can get paired with other things, right? And we know this is the case. Sometimes it's a really strong response. Sometimes it can be just one thing, one time pairing it. Like, you ever eat anything that made you sick? Did you go right back and eat that thing? No, just that one experience created this conditioned response where you then start to avoid. And as this goes back to the avoidance and stuff, well, one thing that can get conditioned because the physical sensations are such a part of the anxiety response, sometimes people become really hypersensitive and hypervigilant to their body sensations. And it can just take that sensation going off where it can automatically trigger an anxiety response. Happens often with like hyperventilation and with the dizziness. I've worked with a ton of people who got really hypersensitive, and every time they start to hyperventilate, they get kind of dizzy, and then that dizziness would trigger almost an immediate panic response. So hypervigilance has us focusing on ourselves. We get hypersensitive to what's going on in our body. That leads to hypersensitivity to those physical sensations, and that can be enough to just trigger anxiety and panic without us necessarily even thinking about it. Sometimes people complain of having out of the blue panic attacks in situations or experiences that they never would even imagine that they have them. And it's typically because of the body hypersensitivity. So then we just do a series of exercises, which you can see on here. They note the sensations, and we're able to identify how uncomfortable they are with those sensations or how scary that those sensations are to them. And then once we identify that there might be some body hypersensitivity, we just have them do repeated exercises of going through that. And then at one point, because, as we said, these sensations are such a part of anxiety, well, we do have a substance that can mirror anxiety and panic. And so we get to a point in treatment where I'll ask them, I'm like, okay, if I would give you a pill that would cause you to have a panic attack, would you take it? And if they say yes, we're in really good shape. If they say no, we've still got some work to do. Because ultimately, what's the worst thing about having a panic attack? You're just uncomfortable for a couple minutes, right? There's nothing dangerous or threatening about it. You're just uncomfortable for a few minutes. But what else can stimulate the same sensations? Dun, 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 dun. Caffeine, right? So we'll often do a caffeine induction where we have people take high levels of caffeine. Of course, nothing that would be anything toxic, but the difference between this and the other assessment is once you get the caffeine in there, you have to just stick it out and go through it, right? You can't kind of stop it by stopping doing the exercise. You just have to get it out. So caffeine induction also helps us to habituate to those sensations and break that conditioned response. This just talks about how we do it and how we monitor it. And then phase 5. Phase 5 is our relapse prevention. This is when the whole goal of this whole program is to help individuals become their own therapists and their own masters of anxiety. Right? And so there comes a point where we have to look and see whether there's any safety nets that are going on. What are common safety nets? Well, believe it or not, sometimes alcohol and drugs can be common safety nets, right? So what is a great social lubricant? Alcohol. Why do we even call it a cocktail party, right? Because the alcohol as a depressant helps us to depress our inhibition. So if we have social anxiety, well, the alcohol can help us to kind of like cut through that. In fact, when I got, like I said, I got my doctorate at Northern Illinois University. When I was there, I was working in the anxiety disorder program, and I got a kid referred to me, right? And he got referred not because of anxiety, but because he was drinking before class. So he showed up to class drunk and got referred by the university. Well, there's a reason the kid was drinking is because he had social anxiety, and he would drink at least a 6-pack before he could go to class in the morning because the alcohol helped him to get through. Now, what's really interesting about this kid is he was a soccer player. He played soccer at the university team, and he played on his school's national team or his country's national team. So this dude was absolutely used to being in front of people all the time. But when he moved to the States, he started having intrusive thoughts. And guess what his worry was? His worry was that he would sweat, and people would see him sweat and think that he's a sweaty, stinky foreigner. And so then he started to drink before class. And so the alcohol was a safety net for him. Now, understandably, after we went through the anxiety treatment and cleared all the anxiety out, all gone, didn't have an alcohol or substance abuse issue. He was using it. He was self-medicating with the alcohol. And the way that we wrap that up, The final experiment that we did, which turned the corner for him, is I had him wear the same practice clothes to practice all day for a week. And then on that Saturday, he had to wear those clothes and go up and down the elevator in the library with a bunch of people. He did that about 5 times and was just like, I got this, no problem. I understand that I was blowing this threat way out of proportion. But companions are often other safety nets. Sometimes I had one young lady who was so afraid of throwing up that she was doing much better. We got her back to her functioning. I asked her if there were any safety nets that she was doing. She couldn't think of any, but I asked her to think about it between now and the next time that she came in. She came back, she's like, you know what? I think I do have a couple safety nets. I leave spare clothes in my locker at school just in case I throw up on my clothes. Then I have something, a backup. And she said, and I chew gum all the time because if I get acid reflux and I burp, I don't like the taste of it. And it makes me really worried that I'm then going to throw up. So I said, fantastic. Well, we're just going to test whether those safety nets or not. So, take the clothes out of for a week and no gum for a week. And then we're going to find out whether you need that stuff or whether it's just that you want that stuff. Because I like to chew gum as well, but I don't need the gum. I just like to have the gum. Because when the dragon is in charge, sometimes we come up with and we believe that we have these choices, but when the dragon is in charge, we do not have choice, right? The dragon is making the decisions for us. So by doing those experiments and cutting out those safety nets, we realized that it wasn't needed. She didn't have to need that. But she then at that point, after having done those experiments, she could choose to do that. And we also want to define success, and we got to review our miracle question. So we talked about safety maneuvers and safety nets. They're just actions designed to prevent a threatening event from occurring. And sometimes they help us to cope with a threat, like having a companion. And so until recently, treatment may have taken that, well, if it helps, do it approach. However, we know that this isn't the case, especially with anxiety, because if we continue with those safety maneuvers, we continue to reinforce the idea that there's actually something wrong that you need safety from, right? They reinforce the false alarm of danger. These are just identification of some safety maneuvers that people will often use, right? Use of alcohol, drugs, medications, smoking weed before the football game because I'm uncomfortable in crowds. I had a woman that I worked with once who carried around a Xanax with her. Now, she didn't like to take the Xanax because she didn't like the way it felt with her body, but she carried it around because she felt she needed it. And when she showed me the Xanax, I mean, she'd been carrying it around for like 8 years, right? It was like crushed into tiny little powder. I don't even think it had any efficacy anymore, but she just felt like she had to be carrying that around. Like I said, safety maneuvers continue to maintain false alarms. They contribute to chronic anxiety, and they just more and more interfere with your life. So how do we define recovery? Well, the panic attacks or the anxiety attacks stop. The worry about panic stops, and that chronic anxiety that we have of constantly being on edge and like the other shoe's going to drop is eliminated. We're not engaging in those safety maneuvers, and our comfort zone has increased, and we no longer have that hypervigilance or hypersensitivity to our body sensations. And so by having done that miracle question, right, we also have really clear and specific and concrete goals to help us to evaluate the progress that we made. Because I can tell you, if I don't ask that question, we get to a point in therapy where I'll say, geez, it really seems like things are going so much better. And the response I get is, well, I just still feel like things aren't good or aren't okay. Okay, well then that's where we get stuck in the ambiguity then, right? But if we have real concrete, clear and specific and concrete goals that we've been evaluating, that certainly helps us. And I should never have anxiety or never have another panic attack. Well, I should never feel stressed. These are all understandably myths, because you're never going to take the anxiety away because it's built into us. We just want to know that we have strategies and tools that we can master our anxiety and our panic. So we have setbacks versus relapse. I know we're running a little low on time, so I'm zipping through this. There we go, reflecting back on the miracle question. And good quote, nothing diminishes anxiety faster than action. We got to take it on. Okay, I rifled through everything. We still got some time for questions here. I believe, Ashley, if there's any questions, I see that there's a couple up there.
Yes. There are a few. So one of the questions is, do you use the dragon sheets with adults or different metaphor? I work with high school students and I think these worksheets would be beneficial, but wondering if the dragon metaphor might be a bit too kiddish.
Yeah, I tell you, I use it with adolescents all the time. But again, I explain that, hey, you know, it's not like you really have a dragon, right? But we're using this as a metaphor because it helps us to understand some complicated things more. If you don't want to call it a dragon, you just want to call them intrusive thoughts, that's fine with me. But we really want to clearly identify them. And it doesn't matter what we call it on the worksheet. The structure of the worksheet helps us to go through. If you want to kind of take the dragons and scientists off of there, no problem. I've just found that it makes it much more user friendly, even for adolescents and adults. But yeah, sometimes it's a little trickier working with adolescents, and if they perceive something as a little, a little hokey or childish, that might kind of might turn them off a bit.
Yeah. Another question is, do you work with youth or parents outside of where you reside?
Um, if it's in the state of Wisconsin, I can, but after there are still COVID allowances for doing telesessions across state lines, but it becomes a licensure issue. So I sometimes do coaching with some of the former athletes that I've had if they're going off to college, or the kids and that, and we kind of call it coaching instead of therapy, because you can't do therapy across. I mean, you can now for COVID, but just for a little while. But otherwise, you have to get jurisdiction in that other state.
Okay.
Licensure, I should say.
I think there was also one in the chat. In the beginning, you talked about like the 80%. Do you know what age that was for?
That was with adults.
What age range were included in the 80%?
Boy, I would have to look back. I'm guessing it's probably a wide range of probably 18, 19 to 45, 50. I'd have to go back to the study and look at what the sample was, but that was with adults.
Okay. One thing I heard is breathing control during a panic attack. Surprisingly, I heard that you are supposed to hold your breath as long as you can, so it slows your breathing down from hyperventilation. Is that true?
Well, if you don't breathe, then you're not sucking in oxygen. So I could see how that might be misinterpreted as a good way to manage it, because you're not continuing to flood yourself with oxygen. But ultimately, the best is you just want to kind of like regulate. And the easiest way is make sure you breathe out. My son back in the day used to, when he was little, he was playing football, and they practice in like, full pads and like 100 degrees. He was like in 4th grade, and he comes off and he's totally hyperventilating. And I'm like, oh, it's no problem. I know what's going on. Just breathe out. So, I can't. Just breathe out. It's okay. It took like a minute and a half, and then he was all set. And another kid came off like 5 minutes later. Totally serious. But thankfully, I knew it was going on, because then if you help them to understand it, then it doesn't become all scary and freaky moving forward. Because sometimes I'll see kids that after they hyperventilate, they get so scared of it, they think like they're going to die or that something's wrong with them.
Right. Right. Yeah. Especially if it's like the first time they've ever had it too.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's see. Do you have any suggestions for how to find a good therapist for an adolescent who is experiencing anxiety?
Yeah, I would. Sometimes you can do just kind of like a web search for a cognitive behavioral therapist like near you, or specialist in anxiety. And even if you reach out, I would ask them like what treatment model they follow. Because if it's for anxiety, then you absolutely want cognitive behavioral therapy, and that they've had some experience with that.
Okay.
But you can probably even just, if you find somebody, reach out, call them, ask them what their treatment approach is.
Okay. Are you taking any new adolescent clients in the state of Wisconsin diagnosed with severe GAD?
Yes, all the time. I do have, I think I have like 50 or 60 people on my wait list, but feel free to call my office manager, Jenny, my practice manager. She's, you can get her at the number that's on the end of the, on the last slide here, and she'll let you know where things stand. Always happy to.
Okay.
I wish I could like, work with more people. It's just only got so many hours in the day.
Yeah. And then I know you briefly touched on this, but can you just retouch on at what point does anxiety become a clinical condition?
Oh, that's a great question. When it starts to impact functioning significantly, right? And so, as we said, what you tend to see with anxiety is that people will either their comfort zone will start to shrink and they'll stop doing the things that they used to do, right? And sometimes it can be really fast, like a snowball going down a hill. You see like kids or adults were doing this much stuff and all of a sudden they're just not leaving the house, or they're quitting things. They may have good rationalizations or reasons that they're doing it, but as you see the avoidance and their functioning start to shrink, that's the time when you really want to jump on it.
Okay,
And
awesome.
sometimes people will get out there and they'll do things even if they're highly anxious, but they just experience such a ton of distress as they do it. That would understandably be another time where you'd want to intervene because, I mean, that's no way to live.
Right, right. Okay, awesome. That is all of the questions that I have in our Q&A. I'm going to go
Super.
ahead and just flip the screen really quick. And I'm going to, if it's okay with you, put your contact information in the thank you email we always send out afterwards. So if you do have a question that you don't want to ask in front of everybody, you can reach out to Dr. Mattek yourself for that. But thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Mattek, for everything. I am seeing so much in the chat of how wonderful the presentation was. So thank you. We do have a survey when you leave. If you could please fill that out. It is required for CEU credit, but if you don't need the credit, we still like your feedback. We are doing a $50 Amazon gift card drawing probably on Monday, so you have some time to complete the survey. And again, if you're on a phone though, it won't pop up, but it'll be in my thank you email for that link. It will be recorded and posted on our webinar page. It will be up for 1 week. You can have access if you want to watch this again. And then our upcoming webinars, August 11th, we have our professional development. So where teens can hide stuff in their backpack. And then we are working on our fall series right now, which will be an in-depth look at substances specifically. So watch for information coming up on that. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. And thanks again, Dr. Mattek. I really appreciate the time you took with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks all. Have a great day. Thank you, Ashley.
Bye.
Bye-bye.